you know, is a favorite word of mine. And so I had to entertain the possibility. See, I didn't remember, I started this book not knowing anything about Shmuel. Maybe he was the brother they didn't like. Maybe that's why he stayed in Poland when the other 6 siblings did. I didn't know. I'm not saying that's the case, but I'm just saying, as a writer and a thinker about this problem, I had to entertain the possibility. So I wanted to think about a text that would help me to think through these problems about brothers, conflicts between brothers. And so I started thinking of Cain and Abel, and I thought, oh, maybe I can just go into Genesis and like extract a great quotable quote and use it somehow. So then I started reading Cain and Abel, which is very different from what I had remembered it as being, not least that you actually never find out what they said to each other, right? And I just thought that was such a great metaphor for this sort of insoluble mystery of sibling relationships, let's call it. And then I just got interested. Then I wanted to see the Rossi commentary on it because I thought that would be illuminating. And then it just so happened that my publisher had just published a new commentary on the Torah by Rabbi Friedman. And so I started looking at that. And then it just became so illuminating to me to show how the Hebrew Bible was grappling with the problem I was grappling with as I tried to write about my grandfather and his brothers, that I thought, well, if it's helpful to me, it can be helpful for the reader. So that was the impetus. And then what happened, so once I started thinking of that, I said, well, you just can't have the Torah in part 2 and no Torah in parts 1, 3, 4, and 5, right? But as I looked at it more, I saw that it was like a series of doors opening. I just suddenly thought, you know, what is the beginning of Genesis to some extent is about how do you start writing, how do you start something, right? It's the writer's problem. And then, for example, Noah in part 3, you know, it's such an obvious thing to say, but it never hit me before that, you know, that's a story about annihilation and survival, right? So I just suddenly started seeing how these biblical narratives were illuminating. And I thought, you see, I wrote the book in the order that it happened, section by section, trip by trip, so I didn't know how it was going to turn out. Then, of course, once it was over, I had to sort of pull it all together, but it just seemed to me, as it happened to me, that it was like a detective story. You know, it did build up a certain kind of momentum, and it's kept narrowing down and getting more sort of overwhelming. And I just thought it was actually important to stop that momentum. And because I didn't want people saying, oh, it's such an exciting Holocaust detective story, right? Because it isn't. I mean, as this gentleman just pointed out, these are real people, these things really happen, they're not characters in a book, and that I wanted a way to stop the reader and force the reader to reflect on the larger ethical and moral issues that arise out of the circumstances that I was describing in the book. And that seemed to me to be necessary. So that's why I did that. It's also something I did in my first book. So it's not a totally to intersperse these ancient texts with modern narrative, so it's not totally, I didn't think I would be doing it in this book, but I ended up doing it. I just used a different text. So that's how it happened. Yes, sir?
To take the title of your book, of your talk, between memory and history, I wonder if you could elaborate a little on your thoughts about memory. I heard a good deal, particularly at the end, about history, and about how you imagine we might look back, you know, 2,000 years in terms of history. But of course, in that ritual you were talking about the Red Sea parts. So that's probably a memory rather than history. And I'm just asking you to, you know, reflect on where you are in your own work, in this particular work, on that spectrum between memory and history.
Well, I mean, you know, the issue, which seems to me of great interest, is that on the one hand, it seems to me there's the imperative of truth as best as one can get at it, which is the big caveat in that sentence. On the other hand, you know, if I wrote a book that contained every piece of information that I gleaned, it would be 8,000 pages long and nobody would read it. So it's about storytelling. You know, my concern is about the way in which the talent or the impulse of a narrator is always shaping the story. So, right, everything in the book is true. It really happened. It's all on videotape. I didn't make it up. You know, not like that guy with the millions of pieces. But I had to shape it, right? You know, there's trips I took that aren't in the book because they didn't reveal anything. They were boring. They just repeated things I already knew. Blah blah blah. Right? So that's where I stand on the spectrum. You know, it has to be a story, or else nobody's gonna. You know, the story is the pill that you take to get the medicine, and the medicine is the truth as best you understand it. But to me, I'm not a historian. I don't even know how historians deal with this problem. Real historians deal with this problem. But you know, it's like you read these books. That's really what I'm concerned about tonight. You know, you see the rise and fall of the Third Reich or something, and like, oh, I read that book, and now I know about the rise and fall of the Third Reich. And I say, no, you know what that guy wanted you to know about the rise and fall, because and also his publisher said it has to come in under 700 pages, by the way. Right, I remember my publisher said it can't be over 500 pages, and it's actually 503. Just as a little message from me to my publisher. But, you know, actually it's a new paperback edition coming out next month. I cut 20 pages. You know, so that's the tension I'm interested in, about the tension between, let's call it reality and storytelling. You know, somewhere it's a balancing act, right? So, you know, somebody just wrote to me and said, oh, I want the transcript of the interview that you did with my mother. I'm not sure I know how I feel about that, actually. You know, well, this goes to the thing that Meg Grossbart said, right? Once she tells me her story, it's my story. And that is the most canny thing that anyone said to me. Well, that's what Janet Malcolm's entire career is about, right? The journalist and the murderer, right? That the journalist absorbs the interviewee, right? And it all becomes your story. That's just a fact of writing and literature. And it's an interesting thing to reflect on. Somebody over there.
So, I mean, it seems to me like the facts and the truth, whatever that would be, don't have legs. They don't have a life of their own, and where they go forward is when they become incorporated into the story. You know, we say, like, for example, siblings in a family each grew up in a different family, right? And so, you know, when we talked about the Passover Seder, okay, and you know, we don't actually know some of the facts, and scholars, in fact, would say these facts are implausible, but I guess where we go with it is that we picked up some kind of motivation. You know, what is this story? How do we take this forward? And we say, so therefore, love the stranger and the orphan and the widow, and take care of them because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And so that's like it's like the purpose. So, you know, without trying to sound really postmodernist about this, I almost don't know that there are facts, or that if there are facts, that they don't travel.
Right. Oh, well, I tend to agree with that. I think that's a very interesting notion. I mean, they are important, right? Because, I mean, it's interesting that there have been so many controversies recently about false memoirs, you know, and our irritation with authors whose books that we bought because we wanted a, you know, heartwarming tale of recovery or whatever it is that we want. So you buy the James Fry book and it's like, oh my God, he was on the airplane and he had no teeth and he was being ravished in prison every day, and then it turns out he just had a parking ticket. You know, it's interesting. I mean, however you react to that indicates that we do care about facts, right? But the point I think that's very important that you're making is that cultural memory is different, right? First of all, term that we tend to bandy around a lot, and I think we need to be careful. You know, I don't even like when we have that thing where people go and say, oh, we remember. You can't remember what didn't happen to you, right? There's a perfectly good word, commemorate, which is what we actually do when now almost everybody, when we talk about the Holocaust or the whatever thing it is, right, we're commemorating. We can't remember. I can't remember the Holocaust. And I think you falsify and you cheapen the word memory when you use it so freely. And it's so funny that we're obsessed with memory. You know, people meet on the street, they're like, how much memory do you have? You know, I want more memory, I want more memory. But memory, you know, Leon Wieseltier said to me, he said, you know, what we worry about so much is not memory, but storage, which is different, because of course the whole point of memory is that it's organic, right? It's your brain sorting through things, right? Everything that ever happened to you isn't memory, that's just your hard drive, right? It's exactly like the difference between operating memory and hard drive space, right? And so cultures remember, so to speak, I use the word figuratively, in important ways. So the Haggadah is a memory object, right? Whether the Red Sea parted, as it does in my favorite movie, The Ten Commandments, I can't tell you. But the punchline is what's important, right? The salient thing, that's what I said, you know, that's what I meant at the end of my remarks, that whatever the Holocaust, you know, what happened to my family is not important, right? Of course it's important, but it's, what will be remembered 2,000 years from now is not Fritka, whatever she was, right? Or me, who wrote about her or anything. But this thing happened, right? It's like we were slaves and then we were free. That's basically what people say once a year in April. We were slaves and then we were free, right? And that's why we, as you said, right? Widowed, the orphan, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, the Holocaust has its own large message. Look, it's already happening. There's already an annual Holocaust Day, because you can't remember it every day, 80 years later. You just can't, unless it happened to you. That's different. I'm talking culturally speaking. You see what I'm saying? So I think you're making a very important distinction, which is that, you know, nations remember things. And when they forget, they also forget things. Just read the newspaper, right? So that's interesting to think about too. But I think it's a very important point. So in that sense, that's exactly my point, right? The individual details, the facts, won't individually matter 2,000 years from now. It's the mass of what the takeaway. That's my new favorite word. The takeaway, right? That's what it's about. Maybe one more.
This is something that I struggle with, and I'm just wondering what if you have come across this in your travels and in your research as a child of survivors. You know, I struggle with the obsession to know more about the story and the feeling that, you know, I'm not a primary mourner. So I don't, and also I think I also internalize my parents' ambivalence about knowing the story and not wanting to know it, us to know the story. And I just wonder, you know, we're talking about passing it on, passing the legacy of the Holocaust on. And I think, you know, it depends on how many degrees of separation you are from the story itself. I'm not being very articulate, but, you know, what about us, you know, the second generation? What's our...
Well, it's an interesting, did people hear that?
No.
It's a question from, this lady is a child of survivors, and I think the idea is just about that generation. You know, there's an issue about transmission, and also about as the event recedes in time, you know, how do you keep dealing with it from generation to generation? There's a sense, I think, of lessening urgency, inevitably, battling with the sense that it has to be kept alive, right? For you, that's a particular personal obsessive issue, but, you know, I want to flip it in a maybe illuminating way from victims to perpetrators. So, and because the question is like, when does it stop? I was talking with Hank about this on the way over. You know, my brother said this amazing thing to me when we were traveling together, because he was saying, you know, it's so weird because we think of Uncle Shmuel and his family as so dead, right? So in the 1930s and 40s, he said that, like, those girls would be our Polish cousins that we would go visit in the summer if the world had, you know, it was such an incredible thing to imagine that that would be possible because, of course, everything came out different. And he said to me that reminds me that the Holocaust is still an event that's taking place now, right? It ramifies continually from generation to generation. I guess I'm not going to answer it, but I'm going to tell you a quick weird thing that I keep encountering, which is that when I was doing my book tour in Germany, the first sort of 10 minutes of every event I did would be like the hosts of the venue essentially sort of apologizing for the Holocaust, right? And you know, and they would say, we read your book, blah, 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 and it's so awful, and we feel so sad. And then it would be like a 28-year-old person, right? Or a 30-year-old, or a 40-year-old, or a 50-year-old. And I would think, why is this person apologizing to me, right? And it raised this issue, like, when does it stop on that side of the, you know, the other side of the coin? I don't know the answer to that question, but it does. It has to, right? Your children will not be as obsessive as you are. Their children, who may not ever have met your parents, will, you know, that's history. That's history. History is something that takes place in time, and time only moves in one direction. Thank you. Sorry, I've just been notified that there's books in the back, and I'll sign them if you want.